Please welcome our first presenter of today. Darnelle Champagne is the co-founder and executive director of Jaden Timoon, a Haitian Creole language immersion program for children based in Brooklyn. As an early childhood educator, Darnelle enjoys her work with children as well as creating original culturally relevant content and programming for the organization. In addition to her direct work with children, Darnelle has conducted a number of parent workshops and presentations on raising bilingual children and preserving the heritage language of Haitian Creole. Please welcome Darnelle Champagne. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Omar. It is a pleasure to be here with you all for this symposium. I'm very excited to share my work and share information about the importance of preserving our heritage languages. I do have a presentation that I will be sharing with you shortly. And here we go. So today we'll be talking about language activism through children's literature. And so before we get started, I'm going to tell you all a bit about me and what I do. So I am an early childhood educator with over 15 years of experience in preschool and elementary school settings. And that's to say that I've enjoyed working with children also in daycare settings as well. And now I've moved on to working with children in a more intimate fashion through my work as a SEED provider. And SEED is the acronym for Special Education Itinerant Teaching. And so with working with children one-to-one, I have the chance to help them assimilate into the space that they're in, whether it's at home or at school, to better engage with their peers, with their teachers, based on their individual needs. As Omar previously mentioned, I am the co-founder and executive director of Jaden Timoon, which is a Haitian Creole language immersion program for children between the ages of 0 to 12. I enjoy curating content for Jaden Timoon that's age appropriate and culturally responsive, as it is work that is done with purpose. As a person of Haitian descent, this work speaks to me personally because it's work that identifies with who I am. It's work that identifies with people, my ancestors, people that I've come from, as well as my children and my descendants. And so there's a connection with this work with me and with the people that I also have connection with personally and collectively through my heritage and through my culture. And so I am a Haitian American born and raised in New York City. I've always had the opportunity to remain connected to my heritage, to my Haitian heritage through language and other aspects of culture from birth, afforded to me by my parents, my family, and my community. My first spoken language is Haitian Creole, and I learned English once I entered school. One thing I didn't learn at a very young age is how to read and write Haitian Creole. And so although Haitian Creole was my first spoken language, the first language that I interacted with in written form is English. And so finally having the chance to interact in Haitian Creole through a literary form, through writing and reading, was very exciting for me. And I'll get a chance to talk more about that later. I am also a mother of 3 trilingual children. My husband and I were raising our children to speak Haitian Creole, French, and English. And so our children at varying degrees are able to communicate in all 3 languages. And for us, languages is very important because it's a pathway to other worlds, other cultures. It's a pathway to communicating with more people and with other people that we may not otherwise have had the chance to. And so giving our children this gift of language, especially our heritage language, is very important. And it's a gift that we ourselves were luckily able to get from our parents as children in our family. Now we're going to segue into activism. We're going to talk a little bit about activism before we enter into the piece about language. So what does activism mean? Activism is the practice of taking direct action to achieve political or social goals. Activism can involve supporting a particular cause or range of causes or opposing it. Activism uses direct and continued actions. And so many of us already have a sense of what the word activism means and how we find ourselves and how we interact and move through activism. And so activism can mean many things for different people. One thing it isn't for sure is passive, nor is it a one-time thing that we do in relation to the cause that we are supporting or opposing. Activism takes on several forms, and we use a number of platforms to express it, from protests to boycotts, to petitions, to social media, and even to just living out our truths unapologetically. And so we have different types of activism. And today we're going to look at, in particular, activism through the scope of language, and in particular, heritage languages. So let's define and think about what language activism is. And for our sake today, in our context, language activism involves promoting one's language and preserving it through action. Language advocates are intentional with their use of language. So through action can look, action has different forms, right? And so with language advocates, what I mean by intentional, they are intentional in how they use language. And in my experience, I've seen with language advocates, their intentionality, they are intentional because exposure matters. Language exposure matters. What you say, how you say it, when you say it, all matters. And because we are advocating for something, it's important that we have a sense of plan, and that we have a sense of how we are engaging with others, and how we are engaging with the material that we are advocating for. And now, depending on one's heritage language, advocacy for that language is likely to take on a very different streamlined process. And so it's a process and work that takes into account the language's history, the people and culture it's generally associated with, and the assumed prestige or stigmas that come along with all of that. And so, for example, we have languages, global languages, which tend to carry a sense of prestige with them, such as English, French. And with these languages, which are heritage language of certain individuals, they're preserving, the preservation of those languages looks very different from the preservation of languages that are indigenous, languages that are often stigmatized, and languages that are not as well known. And so language activism, of course, means is a very different thing for those particular circumstances. And when we take that into account, we can readily see how the work is very different, how in certain circumstances the work is, not only is it different, but there's much more work that is often involved, depending on the language that we are speaking of. And so let's take a look at the language of Haitian Creole, also known as Creole Haitien in the language. And so with regard to language activism, we talk about languages and why advocacy is necessary. So why is Haitian Creole advocacy necessary? Well, language isn't simply a means of communication. It is part of the cultural identity of people. And so for Haitian people, this cultural identity of people of Haitian heritage is part of their everyday life, a part of what they do and how they interact with people. And when part of who you are is devalued, it has deep, long-lasting effects. And so we know that this connection is important, and this connection can look differently for people depending on their experiences and how they've interacted with language. Because of stigmas, the language of Haitian Creole has a charged socio-political history that has created pushback in its use as a spoken language, and especially as a written one. But because of advocacy and education around the language, a shift has begun, a shift that I would say has begun long ago, but with the collective group and with people, with a larger group of people. This is a shift that that has noticeably been seen within the past 2 to 3 decades. And in this shift, we're dispelling many negative Haitian Creole stereotypes. So we now see many Haitians and individuals of Haitian descent, whether in Haiti or abroad, looking to further connect with the language, including connecting in ways they did not before, as with reading and writing. And so as this relationship with language deepens and broadens with the collective, the next question one should ask is, how do we keep this momentum going? And what should language preservation look like? For me, I strongly believe that the answer to that question must involve children. It must involve the generation that's coming up, the generations to come. And most importantly, the young generation that's present, the generation that we can affect in our present day to lead eventually in the future when we are no longer here to affect or be a part of what language advocacy will look like and what will become of it. And by the way, before I continue, just want to remind everyone we're going to take questions. A Q&A will happen at the end of the presentation. And so please keep in mind, keep your questions in mind. And as Omar mentioned earlier on, you can put the questions in the chats, because I'm sure that people will have questions as we go through the presentation and consider all the information that we are sharing. And so back to what I was mentioning, I strongly believe that the answer to the question of how we preserve our language is definitely, will definitely involve children. So how does that look, and what's the best way? We yield better results with language preservation when individuals are exposed to a heritage language and given constant opportunities to engage in this language, starting from when they're young, starting from childhood. And so we know that children are like sponges, readily absorbing information. And because they are impressionable, what they are exposed to from when they are very young has lasting, long-lasting effects, whether positive or negative. We also know that languages, as we mentioned, with being sponges, children in absorbing language, culture, and what have you, these long-lasting effects can also affect how they unlearn certain things as adults and relearn other things as adults as well, especially when it comes to image and images of themselves and images of other people in the world and other people that they interact with. So consistent quality exposure in which the language is valued, coupled with encouragement and support to speak it, is instrumental. And so this is why with what we do at Jardin Timoun is so important. So as a Haitian Creole language immersion program for children, we've created space to celebrate and learn about our language and culture via age-appropriate programming, which incorporates the use of storytelling in children's literature. And so language, interacting with language at a very young age is very important. And how we do it and in spaces that we do it is also instrumental. And so as mentioned before, in Jardin Timoun, we take children the way that they learn and incorporate such things as literature in what we do with the children. So this brings me to the role that storytelling and children's literature play in language activism and preserving language. And now we're going to move on to the next slide. And so storytelling and children's literature in the mother tongue as essential components to exposing children to rich vocabulary and culture. Stories in children's literature further enables language acquisition and language development. And not just for children, but for adults as well, especially adults seeking to learn a new language or reconnect to one, with the nuances of how language is put out and how it flows in literature. It enables a lot of the language learning for all of us. And so from nonfiction to fiction to realistic fiction to folktales, stories and literature encourages active imagination and creativity in children and for adults. Furthermore, when children see themselves and specifically positive images of themselves in literature, it impacts their views of themselves in the real world. It impacts their views of themselves as well as how they present themselves in the real world, how they interact with other people, how they interact with family, how they interact with friends, how they interact with others in other spaces. And as they age, it also, this view of themselves and how they present themselves carries along with them. It's something that lives and survives with them. They see, the children, they see their worth, they see value in language and how it's used for self-expression. And so I want to mention in Haitian culture, we have a rich oral storytelling tradition, often heard in a call and response format called kriak. And so this form of storytelling, although this was long before literature in Haitian Creole was written down in the way that it is now, this form of storytelling was also integrated. It carried with it a sense of imagination. It gave children the sense of imagination and creativity as well. And this form of kriak, which is at Jardin Timoun, we use to inspire storytelling that we do during our sessions. It helps us in continuing this particular tradition in our culture. And so we do this during our sessions with stories that we've created. We also read children's literature written in Haitian Creole and strongly encourage our families when outside of the Jardin Timoun space to do the same regularly. And so I have pictures here of some of our favorite Haitian Creole children's books, which are pretty popular with kids that we have read to as well. They really like these stories. And so these books include books that are entirely written in Haitian Creole, such as the story of Anaël Aklasien, written by Riva Neri Persil and illustrated by New York-based Haitian illustrator Woodney Sano. And we also have bilingual Haitian Creole in English, such as The Adventures of Yaya, written by Angie Bell and Tico Ama, and Princess Mania, written by Sonia Jean-Baptiste and illustrated by Odeva Joseph, as well as the book called Lila a joué boule, which is Lila Plays Soccer, written by Christina Doret and illustrated by Odeva Joseph. And so in these stories, in these books, children get to see themselves as protagonists. They get to interact with their culture, and they get to interact with the language. And so for books written that are bilingual, it helps support children and adults who are new to language learning and can appreciate the story in a language that they already speak fluently, while getting support in the target language, the language that they're learning. But with the books that are written entirely in Creole, we get to see the rich language on its own. And for those who are near fluent or who are biliterate, who are able to read in Haitian Creole, they're able to appreciate the story written in just the mother tongue, the way that it's written. And so we encourage the reading of these books because of their benefits, the benefits of which are plenty, some of which I didn't even mention, but there's a plethora of benefits to reading beautifully illustrated books, as well as books that aren't illustrated for older children and for adults as well. But these books, even with the illustrations, and even with books that are wordless, the pictures speak for themselves at times. These books themselves, with just the pictures, are also a literary form in which children can use their imagination to tell the story themselves. And we also encourage parents to in looking at these books and using the pictures, they can tell their own stories based on pictures, which children appreciate, as well as putting children in the stories. Children love stories. They also love stories about themselves. And these types of stories, all of these stories, pique their interest. It piques their interest because it speaks to them. It speaks to them as individuals. It speaks to their nature as a child. It speaks to their creativity and to their imagination. And these are experiences that children carry with them as they age and as they become adults and as they themselves become parents and share these experiences with their own children at some point in the future. And so at Jardin Timoun, we, in sharing literature and in all the other work that we do with our children, we are now in a space, in a new era of learning where we've had to shift how we engage language learning and sharing literature. And it now has a new look. So we'll talk about that next. And so since the pandemic, we've had to find ways to leverage technology to continue the work of language activism in a new era of virtual learning. And so prior to the pandemic, Jardin Timoun, primarily we functioned in a space. We functioned out of a Montessori school and had in-person classes. And so in our classes, with the methodology that we used, we took into account children's learning styles. We took into account the fact that children are concrete learners. And so in the space, a lot of our activities were sensory-based activities. And we coupled sensory-based activities with language learning and with what's called TPR, which is total physical response learning. And so when we were in a space with children that we had them immersed in the language. So for a more authentic learning experience, we mostly spoke Haitian Creole. also finding ways to support those who were at the beginning stages of language learning. And so with sensory activities, which engage all 5 senses, whether it was water play, whether it was sand play, we also had arts activities, and with the storytelling that we did through Kichwa, we had props, and we used props to engage the children in the storytelling. And so since the pandemic, the way that we engaged was limited. That was actually was stopped entirely, because we were in a situation with COVID-19 in which we now had to socially distance. And so schools were shut down, and we all went into suddenly into a life of remote learning. And adjusting to the space of a remote learning was not easy, especially for children and for families, because we know that the best way to engage is in person. But with remote learning, we found ways to continue that engagement and to leverage technology, as we mentioned before. Jardin Timoun online classes, we now interact with our families via Zoom. And so with Zoom, we've decided to do Zoom because there's still a live component to it. Children are able to hear us call out their names. Children are able to say hello to us. They're able to engage with us in a fashion that they wouldn't be able to through just video. If we were to put our sessions in a video and transmit it to them that way, there's that interaction that doesn't exist. And so this is part of why we decided to use a live platform such as Zoom, so that we are still able to connect to our children in that way. And as mentioned before, children are concrete learners. Their attention span, the way they learn, is very different from how they learn, is very different from how adults learn. And so taking that into consideration was very important to us. And so incorporating movement activities, singing, dancing, and using animation and screen sharing to share our stories with our children and with our family was important to us. And it made a very big difference, because although we are in person, children are still able to interact, and they're still able to interact through their senses. And we've also found ways to interact with them and do art activities via Zoom as well. And so these are some of the ways that we have found to continue our language learning with our children. And so in the beginning of the pandemic, it was very gloomy. It was very gloomy in figuring out, well, how are we going to continue our Creole journey? How are we going to continue this very important work? And we found a way to do it. And the benefits of online learning that we found includes the ability to now reach out to other people that we wouldn't have had a chance to otherwise. And so prior to the pandemic, based out in Brooklyn, families who were enrolled in our program came to our space physically. And so most of these families were families that were local. But now on an online platform, we have families that we interact with all over the country. We have families from California to Chicago, to places such as Florida, to Massachusetts. We've even had families in Canada join our sessions. And we've had a family in particular who prior to the pandemic was New York based, but moved to Haiti and were joining us from Haiti to continue their language learning of Haitian Creole. I want to thank everyone for participating and listening to the presentation, and having a chance to listen and hear about what Jardin Timoun is about, and how we've continued our language activism, and how we've continued our work with Haitian Creole with our children through Jardin Timoun. Thank you, everyone.
Merci, Darnelle. Thank you for the work that you do and for such a great presentation. I just wanted to quickly ask you, especially for those who might be interested in getting into language activism or and even developing professionally doing this kind of work. How do you become a language activist? And can you talk about your experience, developing professionally as a language activist?
Well, first, I am an early childhood educator. And so for me, the lens through activism has always been associated with children. How do we involve children with advocacy through language? Because I was born to a family that was very engaged and connected to Haitian culture, I had this chance to be immersed in that. And so, as I mentioned earlier on, my very first my first language is Haitian Creole. And so, when I started school in pre-K, I think I was about 4 or 5 years of age. I spoke no English, although I was born and raised in New York at home, family functions. My exposure was to that language. And once I entered school, and because I live in New York, naturally the English took on very quickly, and it's now my dominant language. But because of my connection to Haitian Creole and my continued practice of speaking it, I am also fluent in it. I'm fluent in Haitian Creole. I speak the language. And of course, with schooling, in high school and in college, there are times in which the connection was stronger than at other times, but nonetheless, it was always there. And I must attribute that connection to my experiences as a child. My experiences also in which my parents took us to Haiti. We had the chance to travel there and had the chance to speak to other children. I had the chance to play with children and speak to them in Creole the same way I would in New York. I engage in very natural ways. And so it wasn't a matter of sitting down and going through a workbook and going through the subject of the language, but it was a matter of living it, knowing that language is lived, that language is a part of the culture, and it's something that it's a commitment, but it's also something that needs to be consistent. Every day, every other day, it has to be. Whether it's through cooking, and we're talking about what we're cooking in the language. Having those type of experiences is very important. And then with the conscious advocacy, I feel as if I'm amplifying my regular living experiences through advocacy by being conscious with forming Jardin Timoun, for example. I'm a co-founder of Jardin Timoun, and part of founding that program was the activism that we do, just the act of forming the program, the act of forming Jardin Timoun, and the act of enlisting children. My own children participate. And so that for me is the activism, the specific and direct activism that I participate in addition to other forms of language activism.
Are you also connecting your work directly with children in Haiti? Are there projects there, or are you looking, or do you connect with some other organizations there? How does that work goes in Haiti, and making those connections with the diaspora communities here?
Oh, thank you for that question. So this semester, we've with Jardin Timoun, we've been running classes in sessions, in semesters. And so we recently ended our winter session in the beginning of March, and our spring session will start this coming April. And as part of our spring session, we are collaborating with an organization called Friends of Matenois, which supports L'École Communauté Matenois, which is a school in the Lagonave area of Haiti. And at that school, the instruction happens entirely in Haitian Creole for the children through kindergarten, from grades kindergarten through 12th grade. And so our collaboration will involve a storytime exchange project in which the children, the Haitian children at that school, will do a storytelling project with our children in Jardin Timon. And so part of the reason for this, this project is to further inspire not only children in Haiti, but also children of the Haitian diaspora, to inspire them further in the use of Haitian Creole and the different uses of it, especially through storytelling.
Thank you, thank you. That's wonderful work. Now we have a question here from Emily. Thank you, Emily. What has your experience been like teaching your own children the language, and how have they responded?
And so with my children, my husband and I, prior to having children, I've always, even before marriage, I always knew that that I would raise children who would at least be bilingual, and because I'm in the United States, I speak English and I speak Haitian Creole. So I always knew that these two languages would be a part of the language learning journey for myself and my children. And because of that, I prepared myself before that. And with my husband, this is a conversation that we had before having children. And so I tell people that, you know, even as a pregnant woman, I spoke to my belly in Creole. We spoke in those languages even before the children were birthed. And for my children, it's natural. I mean, it's like a two-sided coin. It is a commitment because, as I mentioned before, my dominant language is English. But because it's a commitment that has been consistent, and it's a commitment that I am, I don't know, for lack of words, married to, it almost seems seamless, at least to the children. Not to me, because I know I'm making the effort, I'm making the conscious effort to do what I'm doing. But for them, they've always known, they've always heard, you know, the languages spoken in the home. And with family, even at family functions, we go to functions that are culturally rich, whether it's a dance performance or through organizations that host functions such as Haiti Cultural Exchange, which is an organization that's based in Brooklyn, New York. They host many functions, and many of them are kid-friendly. We take our children, and so they're exposed to the language not only in the home, but also outside of the home. And so for me, exposing the children, for them, has been very natural. Whether it's reading books, we purchase books, and we purchase books in Haitian Creole. We purchase books that are bilingual, Haitian Creole English. We read to them, and they're reading themselves as well. Like my oldest, she just recently turned 8. She's able to pick a book and read it on her own, or read it to her younger brother. And so our engagement in the language, we've made sure that it's part of how we live. And for the children, because of that, it's natural.
And we have another one here from Winnie. Hi, Winnie. How do you think folks who are not Haitian can be allies to the work that you do as a language advocate for Creole?
So what I think that people who aren't of Haitian descent and who do not speak the Creole, one of the things that they can do is be mindful of how they interact with individuals. And education is definitely key. Reading material, asking questions, and being open to what's said to them is definitely one of the ways that people can be allies to Haitian Creole and to the advocacy of the language.
Thank you so much, Darnelle, for this wonderful presentation and for the work that you do. It's wonderful, and it's very important.
Thank you so very much. It was my pleasure to be here with you all.
Imaynaya lillanchu llapakichiswan nuqaqsuti Irma Álvarez Qosqo apurimaq llaqtamantan kani. Qankunawan kay harawit amastarisaq. ¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Mi nombre es Irma Álvarez Qosqo, soy de Apurímac, Perú. Quiero compartir con ustedes este poema, Urupiruna. Urupiruna está basado en la migración. Hace una comparación entre las aves migrantes y nosotros como humanos, también migrantes. Este poema está escrito enteramente en quechua y tiene fracciones de canto también. Con ustedes Urupiruna. Wañuya Urupiruna wakaykushan, yauriman, watachasqa kashan. Mana punkuyuq ch'iwatapi wishq'ayusqa kashan. Mana qarasqa chink'ayuspa, mana wayllusqa muspayuspa. Qachukunata karullamantan muskiyushan, muspayninpi sach'akunaq chakichanwan hapipakushan. Yuyayninpi waytakunaq mishk'inta simichanpi ch'unqayushan. Mana furuyuq rafrachanta isaykushan, fuyukunapi phawasqanta yuyay manaspa. Ch'aki simichan hanllallishan, mayuwan kushka takisqanta yuyay manaspa. Tayta mamanpa yachantataq, tawa muyuriq pirqakunallapin qawarishan muspaypi, yuyaypi ima. Hukninkunataq, wañuy qunchu mayapatpiñan, ch'utrayashanku. Kay suniñanpa tapipas ch'aki uchurayashanku. Wañuq sach'akunapiñan ch'in ch'akatasqa kashanku. Yana puyu waqaspa hamushan, urpikuna ch'usaqman tukushanku. Sunqu nanaypaqmi, wiqi futuriypaqmi. Uyarisunmanmi urpichakunaq waqayninta, waqayninku takiyman kutirinanpaq. Manchasqa sunqu wayllukuyman kutirinanpaq. K'irisqa rafra, aswan mastarikuspa phawarinanpaq. K'atataq sunqu aswan qhispirikuspa samarinanpaq. Rikch'ari urpi runa, takiri. Taki, taki, wichaymanta. Taki, taki, uraymanta. Taki, taki, pañamanta. Taki, taki, lojemanta. Urpi chay, sunqu chay, takiri kapuay. Tarapuy wiñay panchirilay, sunqururuy kipi. Urpi chay, sunqu chay, takiri kapuay. Manara frayuq ñakaspapas wiñaypaq phawanki. Sunquyki ukupi ñawririq kayniki wiñaypaq k'ancharayanqa. Yuyari urpi, yuyari runa, yuyari phawaynikita. Huk allpakunaq rurunpas rurunnikin, huk k'inraykunaq yakunpas yakunnikin. Chayllata. Sunquymanta ñakuykichis, punchawkama, tupananchiskama.
You just saw a poem performed by Irma Álvarez Qosqo. Welcome back again. Now, please welcome our next presenters. Nazca Serrano is a Kichwa Warmi who currently resides in the Midwest area. As a community organizer and storykeeper, Nazca's work is heavily rooted in community healing as liberation by honoring the diverse processes of Indigenous communities in the diaspora. She's currently working in collaboration with Kichwa Hatari, co-hosting radio segments and using media platforms to uplift and center the innovation across Indigenous generations as we continue taking ownership of our collective visions and stories. In the summer of 2020, Nazca helped organize Wambracuna, the first Kichwa youth-led virtual panel across Turtle Island, US, Canada, and Ecuador. A co-created space that highlighted and reconnected the current lived experiences and realities of Wambras, youth in the diaspora. Her most recent work, a written piece called Estamos Aquí, is featured in this year's Mini Latinx Anthology 2021, a work in collaboration with the Latinx Project at NYU. Our next presenter who will be joining Nazca is Charlie Uruchima, who's a native New Yorker of Kichwa Ecuadorian descent. Blending his passions for Quechua, community organizing, and media, in July 2014, Charlie co-founded Kichwa Hatari, the first Kichwa radio project in the US. The work of Kichwa Hatari has been featured in the New York Times, CNN, and others. In 2015, Charlie also helped found the first Kichwa film showcase in the US, Maisumac. Maisumac is a 3-day traveling film showcase, which is in its 4th year. And in 2019 featured screenings in 6 different cities, including Queens, New York, and Quito. Charlie has also worked extensively with grassroots organizations over the years, like Democracy Now!, the New Immigrant Community Empowerment, NICE, and Brand Workers. So please welcome Nazca Serrano and Charlie Uruchima.
Okay, well, thank you, Omar. Thank you, CLACS, for inviting Nazca and myself to the symposium. Yeah, I guess just to briefly introduce ourselves as well. My name is Charlie, as Omar has presented us. I am from New York. Somebody who has been involved in my own process around Kichwa language learning, Kichwa identity learning, or remembering, as I like to say. And I'm really happy to be here with you all. And yeah, I hope we can take a lot of this presentation. Let's go.
Yeah, thank you to all, also the organizers and the folk that have shared this space, because I know this is almost, I think it's the last one, but this has been happening. It was an honor to meet the other artists and other performers. Again, my name is Nazca Serrano. I'm an Indigenous Kichwa currently residing in occupied territory, Menominee and Ho-Chunk territory, to be exact, aka Wisconsin. I'm the daughter of Magola Cachiwango, granddaughter of Juanita Jimbo and Esperanza Velastegui, a community organizer and storyteller, story keeper, and super excited to be here sharing space with all of you, with also the collective, the Kichwa Hatari. Just want to acknowledge to some of the folk that are here with us today as part of the collective that are here with us.
For folks who aren't familiar, I wanted to talk a little bit about who we are, right? It's Kichwa Hatari. So Nazca and I are part of this collective called Kichwa Hatari. Kichwa Hatari was founded in July 2014, actually when I was a grad student at CLACS. Shout out. And you know, when we started, it was the first Kichwa radio project in the US. And I want folks to really understand that when we started Kichwa Hatari, it was really, it was what it says here, right? It's a radio project, and it was really a response to community needs. It was a response to a real need in the community, because there were actual language barriers, and there still exist actual language barriers between communities, and failed recognition of Kichwa communities. There were issues and examples, right? Issues of interpretation, right? Issues of interpretation in schools, courts, and hospitals. And when I remember I got together with folks to get this radio project started, it wasn't really, the aim wasn't really to necessarily, like, the immediate reaction of the community wasn't, let's get a list of interpreters going, right, to alleviate this situation. It was, what can we do where we're stopping these issues or situations from happening in the first place? How can we get community bonded together so that we really don't have to be in these situations and in situations where we're needing interpretation, or if we're needing it, we're empowered enough to know that we have all the right to ask for interpretation and our mother languages, in this case Kichwa. And a very local need. Later over time, a very local need, this very local need that was very specific to like New York, very specific actually to the Bronx, uh, grew, um, grew, and it transcended borders, like, and we didn't even think it would, right? And internationally into places like Wisconsin, right? Like where Nazca is today, and Canada, right? Where other folks from the collective live today, where resources and spaces for these types of conversations weren't being had, and not being had, or not being supported, particularly in these larger platforms that already exist, right? Platforms that try to umbrella us um, under Latinidad, right? Under ideas that like we're this one Latino diaspora, Latinx diaspora, without looking at our particularities and what we bring, and like the issues that we face that are very particular to our communities. And through COVID-19, right? This is another reality, right? This is like fast forward, um, 6 years later after we've started this. I think COVID-19 has provided us with this opportunity to capitalize on this spread that we have, right? This diasporic spread that we have, and we've become transnational activists who start organizing, right? Not just physically in our communities, but also virtually. Um, and that's kind of like some of the projects that we're going to talk about today, like some of the stuff that have come out of that. And then one thing we want to talk about, one thing is what we're going to focus on right today is the work that we do as Kichwa Hatari, right? Now that we've like conceived of a collective, right? And it's not just a radio program anymore. It's like, what are the areas of work, and where do we actually, what are the areas that we go into? And I talk about like how we bring youth along, and how it becomes very like a continuum, right? A continuum for youth to come into the collective, come into this project, be engaged, and like leave, not only with inspiration but with actual tools, right? To do something with it in their communities. And so these are the areas of work, and we're going to be talking about them sort of one by one. And I've listed here some examples, and this is kind of what we like to imagine, right, as like our organizing model, um, as well, right? The areas of work don't exist in isolation with the work that we do in try to organize youth, right? And although we're not like a nonprofit organization, all these big nonprofits, they have these very like strict organizing models. Like, this is what we do. We connect this to certain campaigns, and this campaign is local, national, international. We don't really think in those terms because we're really thinking of the realities of the youth that exist today, and we're trying to meet, again, youth halfway, right? So see, there's some examples like in the audiovisual work, the communication. We have this radio work, right, that we started with, and we have like this documentation work that we do over time. Film festivals like Maisuma, in the sphere of education, we have Kichwa classes, workshops, trainings that we do for youth and adults. And then here we also have in activism, we have advocacy, advocacy in all levels, the local level, the state level, international, and even transnational, right? What's that look like when it comes to engaging youth? And then we have this last area of work, which is the technical support area of work, which I think is what probably what gets seen sometimes the most. It's like the involvement, like it's like this area of work where we started, right? Because folks need interpretation still, right, in the courts, in those schools, and so that's where we still contribute, right? And yeah, and I don't know if I can add this.
Yeah, and I also really appreciate to I think bringing to this conversation that this process, right, more than a model, this process is so interchangeable, and it's so malleable because we understand that like our realities can change, that our gazes can change, our stories can change. So we really we really want to kind of leave that definition to us by us. So I think just, Charlie kind of already talked about this, but just bringing it a little bit more to the center of the conversation, right before we dive into this model, and we do some storytelling and sharing, learning and unlearning together. I think it's necessary also to honor and center these processes, because they're not just processes, right? They're like our lived experiences being like translated into now with like fancy words and cool graphics and stuff. Um, but center the processes of indigenous communities beyond the virtual, the digital era, or platforms, right? Because as much as strategies for language preservation are key and important, they're not useful if they don't center and work simultaneously to protect the livelihoods and struggles of indigenous peoples. Um, so to start, right, getting into a little bit of maybe this first phase, of the model, it is critical to understand that the strongest sense of community derives from shared experiences and histories for indigenous folk in the diaspora. And migration tends to add a layer of separation to a history that is scarcely ever told, even in home countries, right? And so the need to retell our stories, connect struggles, and put our culture in motion is paramount to overcoming the difficult social and political realities of today. So therefore, like we mentioned before, Kichwa, Hatari, the different media, multimedia platforms in which our work exists and is supporting, are created because of that need to act and take back our narratives. So for example, my sumac is the manifestation of that lens, right? It's that gaze that we put back on ourselves. um, it's an initiative led by Andean-based communities and organizations working from the values of strengthening Andean self-representation of stories and histories with diverse audiences. The goal, right, is to inspire Andean folks of the diaspora to harness the power of their experience and create art through media making. More, I think, uh, than it is a project, but it's also, right, this like visual representation of how we want the world to see us, because we don't want to see ourselves in museums anymore. We don't want to see ourselves in these like ethnographic videos. We want to do that documentation and be the protagonist of our stories. So another two, right, another space, another also these, right, I do recognize too, like another healing spaces that we've created, like Inti Raimi Pacha, a project that I believe too came out of another sense, this like sense of urgency, because here we saw kind of the need to elevate and hold the conversations that youth and community were having, um, during a time, one of the pandemic, and how different communities, how communities in the diaspora were celebrating the Inti Raimi, and again, stories that a lot of the times don't don't get don't get the don't get the support, I feel. um, and it was key for all, and I say that because it was key to create content that would reach our communities in a time where we needed, right, to share kind of the sacred connection, but it had to be on our terms, right, with the ability to share the stories and feelings of our Raimis through our gaze, because a lot of the times the stories that are told happen um, without our consultation and our consent, right? And so a lot of the stories in the diaspora, we risk that they're essentially, right, being wrongfully misrepresented, and they're not being told by our voices. So I think right, kind of this first phase where radio and cinematography, photography, all these tools become tools to nurture a safe space for engagement. So in our case, youth, right, they're starting to see themselves reflected and want to ask more questions. You see somebody, right, on a Facebook Live, you see somebody doing a radio that looks like you, that's telling and connecting feelings with you. You start asking more questions and feel okay doing that. And also through the projects, I think we've been able to and had the opportunity to be introduced to so many beautiful and talented different artists, educators that are speaking of the experiences of as Kichwa artists. So I think by making also those connections, we're not only sharing feelings, but now we're sharing visions and ideas and innovating, I think, concrete plans and actions for our present and our future. So then, right, inevitably youth continue questioning and, like I said, feel safe, right? They feel safe in a space to do that. And acquiring this sense of empowerment to challenge and almost like interrupt institutions and systems that simply don't represent our voices, our stories, our narratives. And so by co-creating spaces to have safe conversations that feel true to the experiences, to our experiences, youth begin now to share tools to examine their history and connect, and most importantly, validate their experiences of their current lived realities, right? So one of the examples for us is Tanday Pacha, which Tanday Pacha is one of the first Kichwa youth-led camps that Kichwa Hatari was invited to. In this work in collaboration, we had the opportunity to help with documentation and shared space with youth through workshops. And again, right, it's youth starting to see that that this is important, that this work is important, and organizing with each other these different spaces in places that haven't particularly had the support to do this. And youth are feeling validated and sure, right, and confident and having and questioning in spaces where they can have conversations with each other. So with a lot of intention and care, youth are activating their political, social, and cultural awareness. And this not only affects, I think, how youth begin to perceive themselves, but actually they are perceiving themselves as a sensible community in the diaspora. And it also is affecting how they're embracing feelings of connectedness and therefore protection through organization. And right now we're going to share a little snippet of the beautiful work that we had the opportunity to do with Tanday Pacha, and just share a little bit of the reflections too that came out of feeling okay and safe having these conversations by us and for us.
Nuestra personas, sí, nuestros ancestros lucharon por los privilegios o la representación que ahora nosotros gozamos, y para ellos cómo fue tan difícil organizar, ser maltratados por la gente que estaba en control, y ahora nosotros no sufrimos tal vez los mismos maltratos, pero por ellos ahora gozamos de la representación, o gozamos un poco más de libertad de decir o de buscar derechos que lamentablemente ellos no tuvieron en ese tiempo. Y esa es como una reflexión que siempre es como que wow, me queda aquí en la mente, de cómo su lucha es nuestro privilegio más que todo. Y finalizar con que la lucha de ellos y la lucha de nosotros aún no ha terminado, porque nosotros aún seguimos para nuestra generación dejar lo mismo. Me parece muy bonito eso, de la lucha de ellos.
Yeah, so that's one of the youth also members who helped co-create the space and kind of was sharing, right, her personal reflection, and you slowly started to see that other young people were kind of nodding and were saying like yes, and I think like it was so key too to understand that community or youth-led spaces nurture a space that connects the personal, right, to the political. And that connection brings to the center the fights of our ancestors and those who have influenced the way we navigate within the movement now. And there's, we have other examples too with the workshops, we're really, I think the education and the knowledge sharing that's happening there too is completely doing this right connection to and helping this connection from the personal to the political. And so, right, like youth are gaining different tools for self-expression and therefore creating, I think, spaces with their own voices. And it's important to know that they want to act, right?
Yeah, as Nazca had finished saying, I think it's through this education work, youth are taken through this process where they start, yes, turning that personal into political, right? They're starting to realize that they have a voice, right? And more than a voice, they have a collective voice. Um, there is a collective movement of youth, right, with their voice, with their same voice, their same experiences. Um, and these are spaces that I think, when we started Kichwa Hatari, I think we didn't like these spaces hadn't existed, right? And so now it's about, okay, then like how do we activate that voice, right? How do we put that work into motion? And that comes in so many different ways, right? I think activism is very much embedded in all of the work that we do. Um, the activism, the advocacy work is very much embedded in all the work that we do. There are forms that are more visible, right, of activism. When we think of activism, maybe we think of like protests, we think of like actions. Um, but there's also the work that we've been doing, right, and as listed here, right, it's like the solidarity work, right? Where does the solidarity work fit in all of this? It's uh, for a lot of the youth, it was in Turtle Island. It was responding to um, a lot of the violence that was happening a couple of years ago, and less than a couple of years ago in Ecuador, right, when indigenous communities started mobilizing, and they were met with violent repression. So the youth and with Kichwa Hatari, right, we mobilized and we created spaces like fundraisers. We created like a whole network where we were communicating with folks on the ground. We were funneling resources, funding, support, and also amplifying, right? Amplifying like those needs. Um, and and through this, you really get to see that youth become like in moments like these, like when Runas and Resistance came about, right? You got to see that youth in reality became this bridge, started becoming this bridge, started owning that narrative. They started, to really, make to really like make their own type of activism, right? And here we on the left, on the left side of the images, you have like two compañeras, right, um, who have been one of the most powerful compañeras that we've come across in all of this work, right? And they are artists, right? And how they're starting to bridge their forms of art expression and starting to recognize those as tools for liberation, right? Starting to recognize those as tools that are needed, right, in our movement. And they're starting to also have those conversations, right? Starting to like turn their art into activism and at the same time activating themselves through like these IG lives, right? Talking about topics that aren't really talked about in public spaces, within like the Kichwa diaspora, or seldom spoken about, right? And then beyond like the social media space, I skipped this one, but the transnational advocacy work, right? You know, there's all these spaces where we're trying to exist, right, on the local level, particularly, but like the transnational work is also very important. It's I remember when, you know, we were invited to the UN Permanent Forum, and we had made an intervention. Well, one of our colleagues in the collective, he had made an intervention in Kichwa. Little did we know, days later, people would be saying it's the first time that there was an intervention in Kichwa. Like for the first time actually in Kichwa during the UN Permanent Forum, which for us, that was crazy because we didn't, you know, Ecuador has been invited to these permanent forums every year, and a lot of the representatives from our own home communities, they're coming to these forums every year, but never has there been like this intentional space of just intervening in Kichwa. And I remember for that day, we actually provided our own interpretation. We told folks at the UN, we were like, by the way, we have like an interpreter coming in to interpret what we have to say. So yeah, so those are like the different levels of advocacy. And, you know, then how does that translate then? We've been talking about the activism. We've been talking about this like cycle, right? When people come in, they come in, you know, seeing themselves represented, you know, they involve themselves in the work of the education that we do, and later they become active, right? And then how do you turn that activism into technical support, right? It's the youth being centered, right? Youth are able to concretely and consciously give back to communities with these tools that are gained through these different spaces, and continue to respond to the needs of communities and create opportunities in media platforms that center these realities, right? These realities that we exist here, we exist not only in home territory, we exist out of home territory, we exist in Turtle Island, we exist in New York, Wisconsin, Canada. And, you know, so when we started, you know, like I mentioned before, when we started because there was an actual need for like interpretation, for example. But how do we do this work of interpretation very consciously, knowing that, you know, there are issues that stem from these situations, right? There are issues that are much bigger than just interpretation, right? You know, like how do we treat language justice in a way where we're recognizing that our bodies are also endangered, right? Back home territory and back here, because when we come here, we become laborers, we become construction workers, we become domestic workers, we become restaurant workers, and in all these spaces, you know, there are already precarious spaces where more than likely than to come into to crash with the system. And so here are just you know, some of these like creative solutions, right, that we wanted to highlight here. You know, one of them is this collaboration that we actually did with CLACS. It's this COVID-19 video where two members of our collective, Pancarita Farinango and Adina Farirango, they, you know, even though they're not fluent Kichwa speakers, they were like, we're going to support our elders, right, in this process. And we work with an elder to do the interpretation, to do the translation of you know, precautions to take under COVID-19, creating this education resource. And they created this beautiful graphics, beautiful animations, beautiful illustrations to go along with it. And the purpose of then it reaching, you know, the masses. And, you know, some other examples we have here are like the Know Your Rights, like the Know Your Rights document. You know, how can we preserve our language if particularly how can we tell somebody to preserve their language and speak their language if they're having to worry about their existence here in the States, right? Because they don't have proper, quote unquote, proper documentation, because they can't be free, right? So it goes hand in hand, right? It's we need to understand these realities. We need to understand the realities where folks are from, and then from that, do this work, right? And lastly, I just wanted to mention, like, even through when we're doing this technical support work, we're always centering communities. We're always centering the community because the communities are the experts. And I wanted to talk about a little bit about for example, the Indigenous Interpreters Collective, a new collective that's coming out in New York City, where it's a lot of folks who from the communities who are coming out representing their languages and saying, we don't want, we want you all to know that we exist. We want you all to know that Kichwa is here, Nahuatl here, Mixteco's here, Quiche, Totonaco, all these languages are here in New York, and we're a collective that are going to put out face for everybody, for all these communities, and we're going to be the ones doing the interpretation, right, when it's needed in these institutions, so that the institutions don't really have an excuse anymore to say, like, oh, we don't have an interpreter, right? Oh, we didn't know that that's the language that they're speaking. And so, what we're seeing here is that, at the end of all this, it's that at the end of all of this, that we believe that the cycle starts again, right? Not only are youth engaging from the audiovisual sense, but then they're coming around through the education, through activism, and later engaging through giving back to the community through technical support work. And the youth, at the end of the day, they're inspiring other young people, right, to consider ways to work in Indigenous and diasporic languages that are not rigid, right? That are not just like, you speak the language or you don't, right? Or because at the end of the day, language preservation goes beyond us, right? It goes beyond like the linguistics. It goes beyond the curricula, classrooms that can only go so far.
Yeah, and so in all of this too, I think, right, it's that we wanna work with and through this kind of like critical lens, and yes, because we want to make sure that, right, like the work is sustainable and everything, but we are navigating spaces that continually, right, are kind of pushing us into being really critical about what we're doing, and to being really careful about what we're doing, because right, we're almost like pioneering some work, or we're entering work, or working with and support other people, and yeah, and so we want to make sure that when we first started talking about, we want to make sure that we are seeing this as like this, where we have this holistic approach, and that it's not just like, yes, let's create, content, let's create a curricula, or let's push for more educators. It goes so much more. It's so much more than that. And so one thing that we kind of wrote out was language preservation goes beyond curricula, the classrooms, and spaces at the table, because those approaches can only go so far. It is important that we as community are centered in these processes, voicing our needs, telling our own stories, and dictating our futures. So Doris says, how can we join the Indigenous Interpreters Collective? How can we find more information about it?
It's a good question. Indigenous Interpreters Collection, the collective, sorry, it's run by a bunch of people. Of course, it's a collective, but I can put you in contact with our colleague Fabian, who was part of that collective and doing the work around Kichwa.
I think the purpose too is just like planting a seed for this conversation to continue, and on my part too, I'm thankful, also, like I said, grateful to have had the space to voice also just because as much as it is like this this kind of like bigger, grander reflection, it's also my own personal reflection as a Kichwa Warmi. So thank you for the space, and I hope to continue to have conversations, engage in conversations with the folk here today.
Yeah, same. Thank you all for coming along, and we don't have like a recipe for like how to work with youth. I think it's más bien, or better yet, we have like we want to provide some sort of inspiration, right? Because every community is different. What works for the Kichwa community might not work with the Mixteco community, right, and the youth in those communities. So these are just like some samples, right, and how we involve ourselves in this holistic work, holistic approach. So yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, and thank you both for the wonderful work that you do. And yeah, I think it's very important to hear these conversations, especially for those who are trying to think, how to get involved on, or how to do this kind of work, just by the example of the work that you, Darnelle, and others who've spoken here today and in the previous dates. It's important just to learn more about your work and know how to do it, because sometimes I feel like for some people, for me especially, I can think of that. It's daunting, right? How to get started, how to do the work. So learning from your experiences, I think it's very important. So thank you so much for the work that you do.